wind at Whitefish Point never truly rests. It howls, whispers and sighs across the sand dunes and skeletal driftwood, carrying the chill breath of Lake Superior, a lake so vast that sailors often call it an inland ocean. The water stretches endlessly to the horizon, iron grey beneath a sky the colour of pewter. Even on calm days, there is a tension in the air, as if the lake remembers every name it has swallowed. At the very edge of this wild expanse stands the Whitefish Point Lighthouse, a solitary sentinel that has watched over the graveyard of the Great Lakes since 1849. Its white tower rises from the pines like a ghost's finger pointing skyward, topped by a lantern that once burned whale oil, then kerosene, and now the steady pulse of electricity. Its beam sweeps across the dark waters every 10 seconds, a mechanical heartbeat in a land ruled by nature's indifference. The locals say the lighthouse is alive, that it hums at night when the wind is still, and that if you listen closely, you can hear the faint echo of a ship's bell somewhere far offshore. Fishermen call it the bell of the Fitzgerald, tolling beneath the waves. Long before radar and weather forecasts, Whitefish Point was the final landmark mariners saw before entering Superior's open water or making the long journey south toward the Sioux Locks. To the uninitiated, it was merely a stretch of shoreline, but to the men who lived by the lake, it was a threshold between safety and oblivion. More than 200 shipwrecks lie scattered along this treacherous coastline, their stories etched in rust and sand. The first lighthouse keeper, Captain Charles C. Stannard, understood that loneliness was as much a part of the job as maintaining the light. The winters were cruel, the storms relentless. Supply boats were rare visitors, and when the lake froze, the keepers were cut off entirely from the world beyond. Yet they stayed, lighting the lamp each evening, knowing that for countless sailors, that small circle of light meant the difference between home and the bottom of the lake. Sometimes the keepers swore they saw phantom lights flickering offshore, lights that moved against the wind, as if another vessel's lantern was drifting through the mist. But when morning came, there was nothing but foam and broken ice. It was here, on this lonely shore, that the Edmund Fitzgerald, the pride of the Great Lakes Fleet, would one day make her final fateful journey. But in 1849, when the first beacon was lit, no one could imagine that a century later, a ship 729 feet long, a steel leviathan, would vanish within sight of that same light, taking 29 men with her. The lighthouse's history is a tapestry of duty, tragedy, and spectral whispers. Generations of keepers have lived and died beneath its tower. Some found peace in the endless rhythm of the lake. Others went mad from the isolation. The locals still tell stories of a lightkeeper seen walking the shoreline after storms, lantern in hand, searching for wreckage that isn't there. His name lost to time, his duty never complete. Whitefish Point is not merely a place. It is a presence. The forest presses close behind it, thick with birch and spruce, while the lake stretches out in front like a mirror of eternity. Standing there, you feel suspended between worlds, land and water, life and death, past and present. It is this place, this haunted edge of the inland seas, where the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald begins and ends. The keepers called it the Point. It was their world, a sliver of sand and stone surrounded by the vast, unpredictable fury of Lake Superior. For more than a century, Whitefish Point Lighthouse stood as the guardian of a stretch of water so perilous that even the most seasoned mariners spoke of it with quiet respect. By the late 1800s, Superior's shipping lanes had become a vital artery of industry. Iron ore, timber, and grain were carried down from Duluth and Thunder Bay, bound for steel mills and ports across the lower Great Lakes. But between the Sioux Locks and Whitefish Bay lay a treacherous gauntlet, shoals, reefs, and sudden storms that could rise in minutes. The keepers of Whitefish Point were the sentinels who faced this peril every night. The original lighthouse was a simple brick tower, its lantern fueled by whale oil that had to be hauled in barrels over rough terrain. Later, a skeletal iron tower replaced it, the one that still stands today, constructed in 1861. The new design, with its steel lattice frame, could better withstand the gales that roared in from the northwest. But even iron was no match for Superior's wrath. In those early decades, tragedy was frequent. In November of 1869, the SS Niagara ran aground just north of the point, its hull torn open on the hidden reef that mariners came to dread. The keepers heard the ship's distress gun booming in the night, but by the time they reached the scene, the lake had already claimed her. Only a handful of men made it to shore, frostbitten and delirious. The rest were never found. The wrecks continued to mount. Schooners, steamers, barges, each a new entry in the lake's grim ledger. Locals began calling the region the graveyard of the Great Lakes. Some said the fog itself was cursed, that it lured ships off course. Others believed the spirits of the drowned lingered near the lighthouse, drawn to its eternal flame. Keepers reported strange happenings. Tools moved on their own. Doors that had been latched would creak open in the dead of night. One keeper, a man named William George, wrote in his 1904 logbook, "The wind ceased for several hours, but the tower continued to hum as though the gale still blew. I went to investigate and found the lantern glass fogged, though no moisture was present. A face seemed to appear in the reflection, gone when I blinked. I shall not speak of this to the others. The Great Lakes were not merely bodies of water. They were forces of nature, alive in ways that defied logic. Mariners believed that Superior in particular had moods, and that when angered, she would take what she was owed." The keepers of Whitefish Point felt this truth keenly. They were bound to the lake, part of its endless rhythm of loss and endurance. Each storm left behind not only wreckage, but also memory, flotsam washing ashore alongside fragments of lives abruptly ended. Some nights, the keepers would find sealed bottles with letters inside, scrawled messages never meant to be read. By the turn of the 20th century, technology had improved. Better lenses, radio beacons, fog signals. Yet even then, Whitefish Point could only do so much. Its light could warn, not save. It could illuminate, not intervene. And still, the ships came, larger, faster, built of steel instead of wood. They carried confidence and commerce, but also a quiet arrogance. For each new advancement, the lake seemed to answer with greater fury. The keepers watched it all, year after year, men of duty and silence. They kept the lamps trimmed, polished the Fresnel lens until it shone like a jewel, and logged every passing vessel. They were the record keepers of tragedy, writing down the names of ships that would later be whispered in maritime lore. One night, in the autumn of 1913, the lighthouse was tested as never before. A storm, later called the Great Storm of 1913, tore across Superior with hurricane force. 17 ships went down. The lake turned white with snow and spray. The keepers could do nothing but keep the light burning and pray that some would see it. When dawn finally broke, debris littered the beach. Splintered timbers, a broken mast, and the lifeboat of the SS Henry B. Smith, its name painted in black letters still visible. No survivors. The lake had claimed them all. After that storm, the men who worked at Whitefish Point began to say that something had changed. The tower's hum was deeper. The air around the lens seemed to vibrate with unseen energy. Some swore they saw figures in the fog, walking the shoreline with purpose, as though searching for something lost. and perhaps they were. Decades later, another storm would come, another November night. Another ship, proud, mighty, and unsuspecting, would find herself at the mercy of Lake Superior. The keepers at Whitefish Point would see her lights vanish into the dark, and the legend of the Edmund Fitzgerald would be born. By the middle of the 20th century, the Great Lakes had transformed from a rugged frontier into a roaring artery of industry. The iron ore that fueled America's rise to power was mined from the Mesabi Range of Minnesota and shipped eastward across Superior. Lumber, coal, grain, everything moved by ship. And Whitefish Point stood sentinel over the busiest and most treacherous stretch of them all. From the tower's lantern room, the keepers could see the silhouettes of giants on the horizon. Massive ore carriers, black and red against the grey waters, their decks stretching nearly 3 football fields in length. The old schooners and wooden steamers were gone. In their place came vessels of riveted steel. Lakers, the mariners called them, crewed by men whose lives were defined by wind, water, and iron. The Lighthouse logs from the 1950s read like an inventory of an empire. Each night, the keepers recorded the names of ships passing Whitefish Point: Arthur M. Anderson, Wilfred Sykes, Philip R. Clark, John G. Munson. To most, they were just freighters. But to the men who sailed them, they were living things, each with its own temperament and voice. The hum of the engines, the vibration of the steel hull. These were the heartbeats of the Great Lakes. Whitefish Point remained the watchman of this maritime kingdom. By then, the US Coast Guard maintained the station, and new technologies had joined the old: radio transmitters, foghorns, and radar. Yet the lake remained as unpredictable as ever. The keepers, though fewer in number, carried on the same lonely duty as their predecessors, lighting the tower's beacon each dusk and listening to the wind. One of them, a quiet man named Keeper Thomas Hartwell, often walked the beach at night. He said it helped him hear the lake's mood. In November of 1966, Hartwell recorded in his log, "The barometer falls. I can feel the storm coming long before it arrives. The wind grows restless, like a beast stirring. I swear the sand moves on its own, and the trees groan like they remember the storms before." He wasn't wrong. Superior's November storms had always been the deadliest. The warm air from the south collides with the Arctic cold, and the lake becomes a boiling cauldron of wind and waves. It is said that when the wind screams across the point, you can hear voices in it, captains calling orders, men praying, or something older still. In this harsh environment, the ships grew stronger, faster, and larger. The ultimate expression of this industrial might was launched on June 7th, 1958. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Built by the Great Lakes Engineering Works of River Rouge, Michigan, she was a marvel of engineering, 729 feet long, powered by 7,500 horsepower, capable of carrying over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets. She was sleek, elegant, and powerful, the Queen of the Great Lakes. Her owner, Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, had spared no expense. Her interiors were as refined as a passenger liner's, with mahogany paneling, deep carpets, and a full galley serving steak and eggs to the crew. The Fitzgerald was commanded by Captain Ernest M. McSorley, a man of experience and few words. Those who knew him said he was both meticulous and quietly superstitious, the kind of sailor who carried his luck in silence. In her 17 years of service, the Fitzgerald became legendary. She set cargo records, outran storms, and earned the admiration of every port she entered. Mariners joked that if any ship could stare down Lake Superior's worst, it was the Fitz. But others whispered that the lake had a way of humbling pride. Whitefish Point watched her pass many times, her running lights gleaming through fog and darkness. Keepers would note her name in their logs, as they did all others, never imagining that one day she would become part of the point's most haunting tale. By the 1970s, automation was creeping into the world of lighthouses. The Coast Guard discussed the possibility of remote operation. The keepers, once essential, were becoming relics. Yet even as machines replaced men, the storm showed no mercy. The Great Lakes did not modernize. They only waited. In November 1975, a deep cold front began moving across the Central Plains, pulling moisture from the Gulf and colliding with frigid northern air. Meteorologists warned of a massive system forming over Superior. Mariners took heed, but in shipping, time is money, and the oar must move. On November 9th, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, bound for Detroit with a full load of taconite pellets. Another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, followed her out of the harbor, 20 miles behind. As they passed under the sweeping gaze of Whitefish Point's beacon that night, no one could have imagined that it would be the last time the Fitzgerald would ever see land. The storm was already building beyond the horizon, a living thing waiting in the dark. The people who live along Lake Superior have a saying, "She's never given up her dead." Those words are not poetry, they're fact. The lake's frigid depths are so cold that bodies rarely surface, preserved forever in her silent grasp. And of all her moods, none are more feared than the November storms. By early November 1975, the signs were clear. The barometer dropped like a stone. The air took on a strange stillness, and the seagulls fled inland, a sure warning to those who paid attention. The keepers at Whitefish Point knew the feeling all too well. They'd seen it many times before. The horizon darkening, the sky splitting open, the wind shifting without warning. But even for them, the storm that was coming would be something different, something monumental. The meteorologists at Duluth issued warnings on the morning of November 9th. A low-pressure system was deepening over the plains, expected to sweep northward and collide with an Arctic blast from Canada. The forecasts were grim, winds gusting over 70 knots, waves reaching heights of 30 feet, and snow squalls that would erase the world from sight. Despite the warnings, ships continued to sail. The Edmund Fitzgerald, under Captain Ernest McSorley, had already loaded 26,000 tons of taconite pellets at the Burlington Northern Docks and was eager to make port in Detroit before the storm hit full force. Behind her sailed the Arthur M. Anderson, captained by Jesse Cooper, following in her wake like a shadow. Both men were veterans, cautious but confident. They'd seen rough weather before. As the Fitzgerald steamed east across Superior, the wind began to rise. Waves slapped against her hull, but the massive freighter ploughed through with ease. McSorley reported moderate seas, nothing the big Fitz couldn't handle. To the west, the Anderson tracked her movements, their radio chatter easy and familiar. The keepers at Whitefish Point noted the weather worsening and recorded in their log. Wind northeast increasing, sea state heavy, visibility 2 miles and falling. By midnight, the sky turned black and electric. The wind screamed through the pine forest around the lighthouse, shaking window panes and rattling the iron frame of the tower. The great foghorn bellowed across the lake, its deep moan rolling over the waves. Inside the keeper's dwelling, a single lamp burned, the rest of the world consumed by the storm. At sea, the Fitzgerald took the brunt of it. The temperature plummeted, sleet lashed the decks, and the ship's massive hull began to groan under the strain. Crewmen reported waves cresting over the bow, slamming with such force that the deck vibrated. The radar flickered, static filled the radio, and the ship's pace slowed as she fought the gale. Still, McSorley kept her steady. "We're holding our own," he radioed to Cooper aboard the Anderson. The next morning, November 10th, dawned grey and violent. The storm had matured into a full-blown monster. The Coast Guard issued gale warnings for all ships on Superior. Winds reached hurricane strength, gusting over 80 miles per hour. Waves grew higher, 20 feet, then 25, some towering close to 30. The Fitzgerald's bow plunged and rose, vanishing into troughs so deep the lookout could see nothing but steel and spray. The keepers at Whitefish Point could barely see the lake. Sheets of snow and foam obscured everything, but through the blinding storm, they caught glimpses of enormous waves rolling in like black mountains. The air was alive with the sound of water and wind, an elemental fury that no machine could match. McSorley reported at 3:30 p.m. that his ship was taking on water. He had lost both radar systems, and his pumps were struggling to keep up. The Fitzgerald's 2 giant hatches had come loose, letting water into the holds. Captain Cooper aboard the Anderson offered to guide her by radar, maintaining radio contact as best he could through the static. "Fitz, how are you making out with your problem?" Cooper asked over the airwaves. "We're holding our own," McSorley replied, the same calm words, but now the tone was tight, weary. At Whitefish Point, the foghorn continued to sound, a deep, mournful note every 20 seconds. The keepers couldn't see the ships, but they could feel the lake's fury through the earth itself. The wind was so fierce that the lighthouse tower vibrated, the lantern's glass ringing faintly in its frame. At 7:10 p.m., Captain McSorley made his final transmission. "We are holding our own." 5 minutes later, the Edmund Fitzgerald vanished from the Anderson's radar. There was no distress call, no explosion, no light on the horizon. One moment she was there, the next, gone. 29 men disappeared into Lake Superior without a trace. At Whitefish Point, the storm continued through the night, hammering the lighthouse like 1,000 fists. Some say the keepers heard a distant sound between the gusts, a low metallic groan, or perhaps the echo of a ship's bell, tolling once, faint and final. When dawn came, the lake was empty, calm again, as if nothing had ever happened, but the keepers knew better. Something immense had been lost out there, and the lake would never give it back. When she first slid into the Detroit River in 1958, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was hailed as a marvel, the largest ship ever to sail the Great Lakes. Her launch drew thousands of spectators who cheered as she took to the water for the first time, a gleaming symbol of American industry and engineering. Newspapers called her the Queen of the Lakes. To the men who would one day crew her, she was something more, a living presence, a steel leviathan whose power commanded both awe and affection. At 729 feet long and 13,632 gross tons, the Fitzgerald dwarfed nearly every other vessel on Superior. She was designed to haul iron ore from the mines of Duluth to the steel mills near Detroit and Toledo, a vital link in the machinery of progress. Her massive turbines drove her at 16 miles per hour, and when fully loaded, her draft sank deep into the lake, nearly 27 feet. Yet despite her bulk, she moved with a grace that earned her respect from captains and crew alike. Inside, she was almost luxurious by maritime standards. The crew's quarters were comfortable, her galley well stocked, and her mess hall featured polished wood and brass fittings. She even had air conditioning, a rarity on the lakes. For those who served aboard her, she was more than a workplace. She was home. Men signed on year after year, drawn by pride as much as pay. Her captain, Ernest M. McSorley, was a veteran sailor nearing retirement. A quiet, meticulous man with silver hair and a weathered face, McSorley had spent 4 decades navigating the Great Lakes. He was respected by his peers for his professionalism and calm under pressure. He was also known to be cautious, perhaps even superstitious, a man who never underestimated Lake Superior's moods. He often told his men, "Superior doesn't give up her dead." The Fitzgerald's reputation was one of excellence. She set cargo records, arriving early and rarely faltering. Sailors joked that she was too good for the lake, but in the taverns of Duluth and Thunder Bay, older captains would mutter that such pride came with a price. Some believed the lake noticed arrogance and punished it. The Fitzgerald's final voyage began innocently enough. On November 9th, 1975, she loaded 26,116 tons of taconite pellets, small, dense spheres of iron ore, at Burlington Northern Railroad Dock Number 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. The sky was grey, the air sharp, and the first hints of snow swirled across the harbour. McSorley checked the forecasts. A low-pressure system was moving in, but nothing alarming, just another November storm. The Fitzgerald departed at 2:15 p.m., bound for the Zug Island docks near Detroit. She was accompanied by the SS Arthur M. Anderson, a smaller but sturdy freighter, captained by Jesse B. Cooper. The two ships planned to traverse the full length of Lake Superior, enter Whitefish Bay, and proceed through the Sioux Locks to Lake Huron. The first day passed quietly. The Fitzgerald cut through the waves with steady confidence, her engines humming deep and strong. Crewmen went about their routines, checking hatches, logging positions, eating in the galley, trading jokes over coffee. The lake was restless but manageable, the wind building slowly from the northwest. By nightfall, the barometer began to drop. Radio reports warned of strengthening winds and snow. McSorley noted the change, but pressed on, keeping a cautious distance from the Canadian shore to avoid the worst of the storm. The Anderson followed 20 miles behind, keeping her radar locked on the Fitzgerald's steady blip. As darkness fell over Superior, lightning flickered across the horizon, a rare and ominous sight for November. The Fitzgerald's running lights glowed red and white against the blackness. To those on the Anderson, she was a ghostly shape ahead, rising and falling with the growing swell. By dawn on November 10th, the storm had turned savage. Winds screamed across the lake, whipping the waves into walls of water. Snow squalls blotted out visibility. The Fitzgerald began to pitch violently, her bow plunging into troughs so deep that her decks vanished beneath green water. The men tightened every latch, secured loose equipment, and prayed the hatches held. At 3:30 p.m., the Fitzgerald reported damage. "We are taking on water," McSorley told Captain Cooper. "We've lost both radars, and our pumps are working hard." He added that the vents and hatches were covered with water, though his voice remained composed, calm, almost resigned. Captain Cooper offered radar assistance, tracking her progress toward Whitefish Bay. The two ships battled on, their communications reduced to short, static-laced exchanges. The Fitzgerald's last confirmed position was about 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, within sight, under normal conditions, of the very light that had guided mariners for more than a century. The men at the lighthouse could feel the storm shaking the earth beneath their feet. Snow blasted sideways, erasing the lake from view. They knew ships were out there. They could sense them. But all they could do was keep the light burning and the foghorn moaning across the darkness. At 7:10 p.m., McSorley radioed the Anderson one final time. "We are holding our own." Then, nothing. 5 minutes later, the Fitzgerald disappeared from the Anderson's radar. No flare, no mayday, just silence. Captain Cooper immediately tried to reach her, calling over and over on the radio. "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Do you have your radar? Fitzgerald, do you hear me?" There was no answer. The Anderson pressed on, battered but afloat. The storm finally eased around midnight, the lake settling into an uneasy calm. The keepers at Whitefish Point logged the end of the gale, unaware that a disaster of historic scale had just unfolded within sight, or sound, of their very beacon. When dawn broke on November 11th, the radio channels were alive with confusion. The Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie began coordinating search efforts, but no one yet knew the scale of the loss. Ships in the area joined the hunt. The Anderson turned back, its crew scanning the grey waves for any sign of life. All they found were pieces, broken lifeboats, a twisted life ring, fragments of wood and steel drifting in the foam. The lake was calm again, eerily so, as if the storm had taken its due and retreated into silence. At Whitefish Point, the lighthouse keeper walked to the shore and looked out over the water. The horizon was pale and empty. Somewhere beneath that cold expanse lay the Fitzgerald and her 29 men, resting in 530 feet of black water. The lake had swallowed them whole and kept its promise. The night of November 10th, 1975 began like 1,000 others on Lake Superior, dark, cold, and relentless. But by the time the storm reached its full fury, even the oldest sailors would later admit they had never seen its equal. Winds roared at hurricane strength, and the waves grew monstrous, cresting higher than the roof of a 3-story house. The Edmund Fitzgerald, once a symbol of modern strength, found herself in a fight that no steel or skill could win. The Arthur M. Anderson, 20 miles astern, was barely holding her own. Her captain, Jesse Cooper, watched the radar screen anxiously, following the fading blip that represented the Fitzgerald. Static crackled through the radio speakers. Snow swirled across the bridge windows like a living thing, a white blindness that erased horizon and sky alike. "Fitz, are you still there?" Cooper called into the microphone, voice steady but tight. After a long pause, Captain McSorley's voice answered, faint through the storm. "We are holding our own." They were the last words anyone would ever hear from the Edmund Fitzgerald. On shore, the storm battered Whitefish Point with a force that shook the earth. The lighthouse tower groaned, its iron skeleton flexing against the gale. Snow and spray lashed the windows, coating them in ice so thick the keepers had to chip it away just to see the lens. The foghorn bellowed into the darkness, long, low, mournful, a sound that seemed to answer the roar of the waves. The keepers worked by lamplight, logging the conditions as the night grew wild. The entry for 7 p.m. read simply, "Wind north-northwest, sustained 70 knots, heavy snow, visibility nil, waves estimated 25 to 30 feet, barometer 28.66 and falling." The next entry would not come until morning. Outside, Lake Superior became a thing alive, a furious creature of wind and water. Waves smashed against the shore, exploding in geysers of white. Logs and debris hurled themselves up the beach as though fleeing the depths. Somewhere beyond that chaos, the Fitzgerald struggled, blind and battered, her crew fighting to keep her head into the wind. Below deck, the pumps thudded and groaned, trying to rid the holds of the freezing water that poured through the loosened hatch covers. The men, soaked and freezing, worked in near darkness, guided only by the emergency lights. The bow pitched so violently that the deck tilted almost vertical at times. Plates and gear crashed from shelves. The radio sparked with bursts of static, and the ship's radar, their eyes in the storm, had gone completely dead. On the bridge, Captain McSorley stood beside his first mate, John McCarthy, peering through the forward windows into a wall of white. They could see nothing. The compass swung erratically. The lake offered no bearings, only blackness and noise. McSorley was calm, as always, but the lines on his face had deepened. He knew what the others only suspected. The Fitzgerald was in mortal danger. At 7:10 p.m., the Arthur M. Anderson recorded her last radar contact with the Fitzgerald. 1 minute the great ship was there, a green echo on the screen, and the next, it was gone. Cooper thought it might be interference. He adjusted the gain, recalibrated, checked again. Still nothing. He tried the radio. "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Do you have your radar?" "Over." Silence. He tried again. "Fitzgerald, "This is the Anderson. Do you hear me?" No answer. The radio hissed like the breath of the storm itself. At Whitefish Point, the foghorn moaned again, a deep, sorrowful sound swallowed by the wind. The keepers could not see the lake, only sense its power through the vibrations in the ground. They knew ships were out there, but they could do nothing but keep the light burning. For more than a century, that had been their purpose: to watch, to warn, to endure. But that night, the light was powerless against the rage of Superior. When dawn came on November 11th, the storm had passed. The air was eerily still, and the sky hung low, pale and heavy. The keepers stepped outside to a world transformed, the trees encased in ice, the shoreline littered with driftwood and shattered logs. The lake, now strangely calm, stretched out smooth as slate. But beneath that deceptive peace lay a silence too deep to ignore. The Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie began receiving frantic calls. The Fitzgerald had not arrived. No contact since the night before. The Arthur M. Anderson, battered but afloat, turned back to search. The Coast Guard dispatched aircraft. Ships in the area scoured the route from Caribou Island to Whitefish Bay. By afternoon, debris began to appear, small at first. A lifeboat, half crushed and split down the middle. Life jackets bobbing in the waves. A broken radar mast. The name Edmund Fitzgerald was stenciled on a battered piece of wreckage recovered by a Coast Guard helicopter. There were no survivors, not even bodies, only fragments. At Whitefish Point, the keepers watched from the shoreline as helicopters skimmed low over the water. News spread quickly. Radio reports, whispers in towns from Sault Ste. Marie to Duluth. The Queen of the Great Lakes was gone. That evening, as darkness fell once more over the point, the wind began to rise again, a gentler wind, carrying the smell of snow and steel. Some say that on that night, the foghorn gave one long, low call, and in the distance, faintly, another horn answered, though no ship was near. The keepers logged it without comment. The Fitzgerald had gone down only 17 miles northwest of the lighthouse, within reach of its beam, if not its saving power. The light had watched her pass for years. On that night, it burned as bright as ever, but the storm and the silence that followed belonged to the lake alone, and in that silence, Superior kept her dead. In the days that followed the wreck, Whitefish Point became a place of pilgrimage. Reporters, grieving families, and Coast Guard officers gathered in the cold November air, looking out over the slate-coloured water as if it might yield some sign, a ripple, a shadow, a clue. The lake offered nothing but silence. The light tower stood unblinking through it all. Its beams swept across the frozen horizon, the same rhythm it had kept for generations, indifferent to the storm's aftermath. But for those who worked within its walls, it no longer felt like a symbol of safety. It felt like a reminder of helplessness, a light that had seen a ship die and could do nothing to stop it. Keeper Raymond Bud Harrington was on duty the morning the wreckage was confirmed. A veteran of Superior's moods, he had long believed that no ship as large as the Fitzgerald could be taken so suddenly. When the Coast Guard's radio message came through, all hands lost, vessel presumed sunk, he set down his coffee, walked out to the tower, and stared at the lake until frost gathered in his eyebrows. He wrote nothing in the log that hour, but that evening, when he finally opened the book again, he penned a single line beneath the previous entry. "The Fitzgerald is gone. God help those men." The investigation began almost immediately. Theories multiplied: faulty hatch covers, rogue waves, structural failure, bad ballast. Each explanation felt both possible and insufficient. The truth seemed buried as deeply as the wreck itself, resting in 530 feet of water, 17 miles northwest of the point. Divers would later describe the Fitzgerald's final resting place, her hull split clean in two, bow and stern separated, cargo still strewn across the lake bed. The damage spoke of tremendous force, the kind that bends steel as if it were clay. Her final descent had been swift, catastrophic. The men likely never knew they were doomed until the very end. For the keepers at Whitefish, those details did little to quiet the unease that settled over the station. On still nights, when the wind died and the surf lapped gently at the rocks, the lake seemed to hum with a low vibration. Not quite sound, not quite silence. The men began to feel that the Fitzgerald was still out there, moving just beneath the surface. One evening, Harrington swore he saw lights far out on the water, two bright, steady points moving parallel to the shore. He called to the assistant keeper, who came running with binoculars, but by the time they reached the catwalk, the lights were gone. There was nothing but mist and the faint outline of the horizon. Later that week, the foghorn malfunctioned. It gave 3 short blasts, a signal code none of the crew had entered, and then fell silent. When they checked the controls, everything appeared normal. The event went into the log as mechanical irregularity, but privately, the men said it felt like the lake itself had tried to speak. In the nearby towns, Paradise, Sault Ste. Marie, Munising, church bells rang for the 29 souls lost. The song The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald would soon carry their story to the world. But here on the Upper Peninsula, the grief was raw and immediate. These were local men. Some had grown up within sight of the Whitefish beam. At night, widows and parents would drive to the lighthouse and stand by the shoreline, staring into the darkness. A few claimed to see shapes moving on the water, the faint outline of a ship's deck, or the reflection of a lantern swinging in the fog. Others said they heard voices, deep and far away, like the wind calling names. The keepers, respectful but uneasy, did not dismiss these tales. After all, Whitefish Point had known loss before. Countless shipwrecks had occurred within sight of its light. Since the 1800s, sailors had called this stretch of Superior the graveyard of ships. More than 200 wrecks lay scattered across the lakebed near the point. The Fitzgerald was only the latest and the most famous of its victims. On stormy nights afterward, the foghorn's deep moan took on an almost human quality, echoing off the cliffs. Those who lived nearby swore that sometimes a second horn answered, faint, from far offshore, where no ship should be. One December night, as the wind howled from the north, Harrington went out to check the light. The tower trembled with each gust. When he reached the lantern room, he paused. The air was unusually cold, the kind of chill that seems to come from nowhere. For a moment, he thought he heard the clatter of chains, as if someone were walking on the gallery outside. But when he looked, there was no one, only snow swirling against the glass. He stayed there a long time, watching the beam rotate. Below him, the lake rolled endlessly, dark, vast, and unknowable. Somewhere beneath that surface, the Edmund Fitzgerald lay still, her crew entombed in the cold depths. Harrington thought of their final words, their last glimpse of the light, and wondered if they had seen it, if they had looked for it, even for an instant, before the waves took them. That night, he logged his final entry before retiring. Lake quiet, visibility fair, strange feeling of presence near light, possibly fatigue. But he knew it wasn't fatigue. None of them slept well after that night. Over time, the lighthouse changed. The Coast Guard automated it in the 1970s, and the human keepers left. But their presence, and the echoes of that November storm, lingered. Visitors to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, which now occupies the old station, often speak of an inexplicable heaviness in the air, especially near the tower. Some say they hear footsteps on the iron stairs when the building is empty. Others claim to feel sudden drops of temperature, as if the door to the cold lake had opened just behind them. And always the beam continues to turn, sweeping the water where the Fitzgerald lies. To many, Whitefish Point is no longer just a navigational aid. It is a memorial, a silent watcher over the lake's dead. The light that couldn't save them now guards their memory. Years have passed since that cold November night in 1975. The Edmund Fitzgerald rests quietly beneath the dark waters of Lake Superior, her steel hull slowly succumbing to the lake's deep, icy embrace. Her 29 men remain entombed in the silence, remembered only by the wind, the waves, and the stories told by those who came after. Yet at Whitefish Point, life continues in a rhythm as old as the lighthouse itself. The beam still rotates, steady and unyielding, casting a pale arc across the water. Its light no longer guides sailors in the way it once did. The beacon is automated now, unmanned, watched over by instruments rather than keepers. But for those who know its history, its purpose has grown. It is not only a guide for the living, but a sentinel for the lost.